Tonight, I am going to tell you a long and gentle story about three of the most unlikely friends who ever met, and about a poor family they set out to save, and about how they proved, in the end, that cleverness and kindness together are stronger than any greedy lord or any hired blade. There is a scarecrow in it who believes he has no wits at all, and who turns out to be the wisest of them by far. There is an outlaw of the greenwood who has a price on his head and a heart as wide as the forest. And there is a cat in fine boots who can talk his way into or out of anything at all, and who may just be the cleverest creature in the whole of England. It is going to be a long walk through Sherwood together, you and I, longer than most of our stories, so there is no need to hurry any part of it. Let it be slow. Let the words drift by like leaves on the slow brown river. And if your mind wanders off among the trees and comes back again, that is perfectly all right, for the story will still be here, going gently on. There is nothing to solve tonight and nowhere to be. There is only the greenwood and the firelight, and three friends you have not met yet, and a long, soft evening in which to meet them. Now, before we truly begin, a small and quiet word. Many people who listen to these stories find that they drift off more easily when the telling is slowed down just a little, and so, if you would like, you might try setting the playback to a slower speed, something like 0.9 or even 0.75, so that the words come more softly and more slowly still, like a voice growing drowsy by the fire. Some people love it that way, and you may too. Do only what feels restful to you. And now tell the old storyteller who is out there tonight, and leave a small note to say what part of the world you are drifting off in, and what hour it is where you are, for it is a warm thing to think of us all scattered across the earth, listening to the same slow tale at once. Now settle in, and let your eyes grow heavy, and let us go into the forest. The wind that carried the Scarecrow. Far away from Sherwood, in a flat and pleasant country of wide green fields, there stood a scarecrow in the middle of a cornfield, and he was, by his own reckoning, a very ordinary scarecrow indeed. He was made of a suit of old straw-stuffed clothes and a sack for a head, with two black buttons sewn on for eyes, and a friendly crooked smile painted below them, and he stood upon a tall pole in the field, with his arms stretched out to frighten the crows. He had stood there a long while, through sun and rain, and the turning of the seasons, watching the world go by and thinking his own slow thoughts. For the Scarecrow could think, and could move, and could speak, which is a remarkable thing for a scarecrow to be able to do, and he had never been able to explain it, even to himself. He had simply woken up one morning, aware that he was alive, blinking his button eyes at the wide, blue sky, and he had been alive and awake and thinking ever since. And the thing that troubled him most, the thing he thought about more than anything else as he stood upon his pole in the field, was that he believed himself to be a fool. He had straw for a head, after all, and everyone knows that straw cannot think, and so the Scarecrow had decided long ago that whatever thoughts he seemed to have could not be very good ones, and that he was surely the most brainless creature in all the world. This was not true, as we shall see. It was, in fact, exactly backward, for the Scarecrow was one of the wisest souls you could ever hope to meet, but he did not know it, and a person who believes himself a fool will go about very humbly and very carefully, listening far more than he speaks and thinking far more than he acts. And this, curiously enough, is the very habit that makes a person wise. The Scarecrow had made himself wise by being so sure that he was foolish, which is one of the gentle jokes that the world sometimes plays, and a happy one. He was a kind creature too, which mattered more than any cleverness. He would not let the crows go hungry, for all that it was his one job in the world to frighten them, and he had come to an arrangement with them, in his soft-hearted way, that they might take a little corn from the far edge of the field, so long as they left the rest alone. The crows thought him the finest scarecrow they had ever known, and they kept him company, and told him the news of the wider world, of which he was endlessly curious, for he himself could never leave his pole and go and see it. And then, one grey and gusty autumn day, The world came and fetched him whether he liked it or not. A great wind rose up out of the west, the largest wind the flat country had seen in many years, and it came roaring across the fields, bending the trees and tearing the last leaves from the branches and sending the crows tumbling head over tail through the air. The Scarecrow felt his pole begin to lean, and then to sway, and then, with a great groaning crack, it gave way entirely, and the Scarecrow was lifted up off the ground and carried away upon the wind like a leaf himself, out over the hedges and the fields, and away. He was not frightened, or not very, for he was made of straw and cloth, and could not be hurt by a fall, and there was besides a part of him, a curious and adventurous part he had never been able to satisfy while pinned to his pole, that was secretly delighted to be going somewhere at last. He sailed over villages and rivers and roads, spinning slowly, watching the whole patchwork country turn beneath him, and he thought that whatever else might be said about the great wind, it certainly showed a Scarecrow a great deal of the world in a very short time. And on he flew, mile after mile, until the flat green fields gave way to rising hills, and the hills to a great dark rolling sea of trees, and the wind, growing tired at last, began to let him down toward it. The trees came up to meet him, and the Scarecrow braced himself as well as a Scarecrow can, and he came down through the branches of the great forest in a flurry of snapping twigs and scattered straw, and landed at last, with a soft and undignified thump, upon a bed of moss and fallen leaves deep in the heart of a wood he had never seen before. For a while he simply lay there, looking up at the canopy far above and the little scraps of grey sky beyond it, catching his breath, which is only a manner of speaking for a creature who does not truly breathe. And then he sat up and looked around him and understood that he was thoroughly and completely lost. The forest was vast and old and unlike anything the Scarecrow had known in his flat and open country. The trees were enormous, their trunks broad as towers, their branches meeting overhead in a great green roof that let down only a soft and dappled light. There were ferns and mosses and tangled thickets, and the calls of birds he did not recognize, and somewhere not far off the sound of running water. It was beautiful, and it was strange, and it was frightening in the way that any great unknown place is frightening, and the Scarecrow, sitting alone upon the moss with straw leaking gently from a tear in his side, felt very small and very far from home. But he was not a creature to sit and despair, whatever he thought of his own wits, and so he got himself up onto his wobbly straw legs and brushed himself off, and tucked the loose straw back into his side as best he could, and set off walking through the trees to see whether he might find someone who could help him. He did not know where he was going, for one direction looked as good as another in that great trackless wood, and he simply walked, and hummed a little to keep his spirits up, and hoped. And that, as it happened, was exactly the right thing to do, for the forest he had landed in was Sherwood, and Sherwood, whatever its dangers, was home to some of the kindest outlaws who ever lived, the outlaws of the greenwood. Now I must tell you about the men of Sherwood, and about their leader most of all, for you will want to know something of him before he steps into our story. His name was Robin Hood, and there was not a soul in all of England who had not heard some tale or other about him, though the tales did not always agree, and the truth of him was gentler and finer than the wildest of them. Robin Hood was an outlaw, which is to say, a man who lived outside the law in the wild greenwood with a price upon his head and a company of bold and loyal followers about him. But he was not an outlaw because he was wicked. He was an outlaw because the law of that time and that place had become a crooked and greedy thing, bent to serve the rich and to crush the poor, and Robin Hood had refused to bend with it. He had seen good and honest families turned out of their homes for taxes they could not pay, and he had seen the greedy grow fat upon the hunger of the humble, and something in him had risen up and said, plainly and finally, that this would not do. And so he had gone into the forest and gathered about him others who felt as he did, and together they had made themselves into a kind of rough justice for the poor. They took from the rich who had grown rich by cruelty, and they gave to the poor who had been made poor by that same cruelty, and they lived free and merry in the greenwood beyond the reach of the crooked law. They wore Lincoln green, the colour of the leaves, so that they might melt into the forest when they wished to be unseen. They were the finest archers in all the land. And though the powerful men of the district feared and hated them, the common people loved them dearly, for Robin Hood and his men were, very often, the only friends the poor had in all the world. His company was large, but there were a few whom he loved above the rest, and I will name them so that you will know them. There was Little John, who was not little at all, but a very giant of a man, the tallest and the strongest in the band, and Robin's dearest friend and right hand. There was Friar Tuck, a round and jolly holy man, who had left his abbey to live in the greenwood, and who loved a good meal and a good song and a good deed in roughly equal measure. There was Will Scarlet, quick and clever and merry, and Much the miller's son, and many another besides, and together they were as loyal and warm-hearted a company as ever lived outside the law. They lived well enough for all that they were hunted. Deep in the heart of Sherwood there was a great clearing beneath a spreading oak, the finest and oldest tree in all the forest, and there they made their camp. They had shelters of woven branches and cook fires, and a great store of good things gathered from their adventures, and in the evenings they would gather beneath the oak and eat and drink and tell tales and sing songs, and it was, despite the danger, a merry and a happy life. And Robin Hood, sitting among his men in the firelight, was as content as any lord in any castle, and a good deal more loved. On the very day that the great wind carried the Scarecrow into the forest, Robin Hood and a few of his men were out walking the woodland paths, keeping watch over their territory as they often did, when they heard an odd sound among the trees ahead. It was a humming, a soft and tuneless and cheerful humming, of a kind they had never heard in the forest before, and it was coming toward them. Robin, ever curious and ever cautious both, motioned his men to step aside into the ferns, and there they waited quietly to see what strange traveller was coming humming through the deepest and most trackless part of Sherwood, as though he had not a care in all the world. What came around the bend in the path astonished them all. It was a figure made all of old clothes and straw, walking upon wobbly legs with a sack for a head, and two black button eyes, and a crooked painted smile, humming to itself as it came, and looking about at the trees with an air of open and friendly wonder. The outlaws had seen many strange things in their years in the greenwood, but they had never seen a walking, humming scarecrow, and for a moment they could only stare. And the Scarecrow, catching sight of the men in green stepping out of the ferns before him, stopped his humming and his walking both, and looked at them with his button eyes, and did the only thing his kind and simple heart could think to do. He wished them a good afternoon, and told them, quite honestly, that he was lost, and asked very politely whether they might be so good as to help him. Robin Hood was a man who had met a great many people in his life, honest and dishonest, kind and cruel, and he had learned to judge a heart quickly and well, and he saw at once that whatever this strange straw creature was, there was no wickedness in him anywhere at all. There was only a kind of gentle, open, worried friendliness, the look of a lost soul hoping to be helped, and Robin Hood had never in his life been able to turn away from that look, which was the very reason he was an outlaw. And so he laughed a warm and welcoming laugh, and he came forward, and he told the Scarecrow that he had wandered into Sherwood Forest, and that he had had the good fortune to be lost in the one part of England where a lost and friendless creature was most sure to find friends. A strange guest beneath the oak. They brought the Scarecrow back to the great oak, and they made him welcome, and it was as merry an evening as the greenwood had seen in a good long while, for the outlaws were delighted with their strange new guest. They sat him down by the fire in the place of honour, and they gathered around to hear his story, and the Scarecrow, who had never had so many people wish to listen to him before, told them everything. He told them of his cornfield in the flat green country, and of his arrangement with the crows, and of the great wind that had carried him away, and of his long flight over the whole patchwork land, and of his tumbling fall through the branches of Sherwood. The outlaws listened, enchanted, for it was as good a tale as any of them had heard, and told with such simple honesty and such gentle wonder that they could not help but love the teller. Friar Tuck laughed until his round sides shook. Little John declared that in all his years he had never heard the like, and Robin Hood, watching the Scarecrow closely with his shrewd and kindly eyes, began to see something that the Scarecrow himself could not see, which was that this was no fool at all, whatever the poor creature believed about himself, but a soul of rare gentleness and rare good sense. For the Scarecrow, in telling his tale, kept saying that he was sorry to be a bother, and that he knew he was a brainless thing not worth the trouble, and that he would understand entirely if the kind gentleman wished to send him on his way. And each time he said it, Robin Hood liked him the better, for there is nothing so winning as a humble heart, and nothing so rare. And at last Robin Hood told the Scarecrow firmly and warmly that he was not a bother, and that he was welcome to stay in the greenwood as long as he liked, and that as for being brainless, Robin had known a great many men with heads full of nothing but brains who had far less sense than the Scarecrow had shown in the last hour. The Scarecrow did not quite believe this, but it warmed him through all his straw to hear it, and he settled in among the outlaws with a happiness he had never known while pinned to his pole. He found that he loved company, having had so little of it. He loved to listen to the outlaws' tales and their songs, and to ask them questions about the wide world he had watched from his field, but never walked in, and the outlaws, for their part, found that the Scarecrow had a way of listening that made a man feel truly heard, and a way of asking questions that made a man think, and they came to value his company more than they could quite explain. And they discovered over the days that followed the thing that Robin Hood had already begun to suspect, which was that the Scarecrow, for all his talk of being brainless, had a quiet and remarkable gift. When there was a problem to be puzzled out, some difficulty in the running of the camp, or some question of what was best to be done, the Scarecrow, sitting quietly at the edge of the firelight and thinking his slow, careful thoughts, would very often be the one to see the answer that everyone else had missed. He saw simply and he saw clearly, unclouded by pride or haste or the wish to seem clever, and again his gentle observations cut straight to the heart of a matter that had tangled the others for hours. Little John was the first to say aloud what they were all coming to feel, which was that the Scarecrow was the wisest among them, and the Scarecrow was so astonished and so flustered by this that a little straw came loose from his ears. He protested that it could not possibly be so, that he had straw for brains and could not think at all, and the outlaws laughed, but kindly, and Robin Hood told him that the wisest people in all the world are very often exactly the ones who are humble enough to believe they are fools, and that the true fools are the ones who are certain they are wise. The Scarecrow turned this over in his mind for a long while, as he turned over everything, and he was not sure he understood it, but it made him happy all the same. So the Scarecrow found a home in Sherwood and a family among the outlaws, and for a little while all was peaceful and merry in the greenwood. But peace, in a tale, is only the quiet before something begins, and something was indeed about to begin, for at that very time there was trouble brewing at the far edge of the forest, in a poor mill by a stream, where a good and honest family was about to lose everything they had to a greedy and powerful man. And the one who would bring word of that trouble to the greenwood was, of all the unlikely creatures in the world, a cat in a fine pair of boots. The cat in the fine boots. Now let me tell you about the cat, for he is the third of our three friends, and there was never in all the world a cat quite like him. He was a lean and handsome grey tabby, quick of eye and quicker of tongue, and he wore a pair of tall leather boots that had been made for him long ago, and a fine feathered hat set at a jaunty angle, and he walked upright upon his hind legs like a gentleman, which is a thing that most cats cannot do and would not trouble to do even if they could. His name, as near as anyone could say it, was Puss, and he was, by his own frequent and cheerful admission, the cleverest cat in the whole of England, and perhaps in the whole of the world. Puss had come, long ago, From a poor miller's family, the youngest son of which had inherited nothing in all the world but the cat himself, and had thought this a poor inheritance indeed. But Puss had proved him wrong most handsomely, for through nothing but his own wits and his own bold cleverness, the cat had won for that young man a fortune, a castle, and the hand of a princess, and had made him a great lord. It is a famous tale, and perhaps you know it, and I will not tell all of it here, for it is not our tale tonight. But it is worth the knowing, for it tells you exactly the sort of cat that Puss was. He was a cat who could look at a hopeless situation and a penniless master and see where no one else could see it, a clear and clever path all the way up to a castle. There was no tangle he could not think his way out of, and no proud and powerful person he could not talk his way around, and he did it all with such style and such good humour that even those he outfoxed could hardly help but admire him. His old master, the miller's son turned lord, had long since grown up and settled into his castle and his fortune, and had less and less need of a clever cat, and Puss, who was a restless soul and could not abide being idle, had taken to wandering the country in search of others who might need his help. For beneath all his boastfulness and his fine boots and his jaunty hat, Puss had a good heart, and he had never forgotten what it was to be poor and friendless, and he had a particular soft spot for millers and their families, being descended, as it were, from a mill himself. And so he wandered, and he watched, and wherever he found the humble being trod upon by the mighty, he would set his clever mind to work on their behalf, for the sheer joy of it as much as anything, for there was nothing Puss loved so well as outwitting a proud and wicked man. It was on such a wandering that Puss came, one grey autumn evening, to a poor mill beside a stream at the very edge of Sherwood Forest, and found there a family in the deepest distress. The miller was a good and honest man named Godfrey, who had ground the corn of the surrounding villages for many years, and had always dealt fairly with everyone. He had a kind wife and 3 young children, and the mill had been in his family for generations, and though they had never been rich, they had always had enough, and they had been happy. But now a shadow had fallen over the little mill, and the whole family sat gathered by their small fire in fear and sorrow, and it was into this that Puss in Boots came walking on his hind legs out of the dusk. The cat, being a cat, simply let himself in through a window, and sat himself down by the fire as though he had been invited, and swept off his feathered hat, and bowed and introduced himself with great courtesy, and asked the astonished family what the matter was, for he could see plainly that something was very wrong. And the miller Godfrey, who was too worried and too weary to be much surprised by a talking cat in boots, told him the whole sorry tale. There was, in the great manor house that overlooked that part of the country, a new lord, and he was a hard and greedy man named Sir Aldous Grim. He had come into his lands only recently, and he had set about at once to squeeze every last coin he could from the people who lived upon them, raising the rents and the taxes and the tolls until the poor could scarcely breathe. And now his greedy eye had fallen upon the mill by the stream, for it was a good mill, and well placed, and it made a steady living, and Sir Aldous had decided that he wanted it for himself. He had declared that the miller owed him a great sum in back taxes, a sum that was invented and unjust, and that no one could possibly pay, and he had given the family until the end of the month to pay it in full, or to be turned out of their home forever, so that he might take the mill and run it for his own profit. The family had no way to pay, of course, for the sum was designed so that they could not. And so they faced the loss of everything, the mill that had been in the family for generations, the only home the children had ever known, their whole livelihood and their whole world, all of it to be seized by a greedy man who had more than enough already and simply wanted more. The miller's wife wept as Godfrey told the tale, and the children clung to her, and the honest miller himself sat with his head in his hands, for he could see no way out of it at all. And Puss in Boots listened to all of this with his green eyes narrowing and his tail twitching, for if there was one thing in all the world that Puss could not abide, it was exactly this, a proud and grasping lord using his power to crush an honest family who had done nothing to deserve it. Puss told the family then and there that he would help them, and that they were not to despair, for he was no ordinary cat, but the cleverest cat in all of England, and he had brought down prouder men than Sir Aldous Grim with nothing but his wits. The family hardly dared to believe him, for what could a cat do against a powerful lord, however clever? But there was something in the way Puss said it, some spark of bold and merry confidence, that kindled a small flame of hope in them even so. And Puss, having promised his help, set his clever mind to work at once, for he knew that a scheme against a powerful man is a delicate thing, and that he would need more than his own 2 paws to see it through. He would need allies, he would need strong and willing friends. And as it happened, Puss had heard the tales, as everyone had, of the bold outlaws who lived in the greenwood nearby, and made it their whole purpose to defend the poor against exactly such men as Sir Aldous Grim. And so the very next morning, Puss in Boots set off into Sherwood Forest to find Robin Hood. 3 unlikely friends. Puss had not gone far into the great forest before he was found, for the outlaws watched their woodland well, and a cat in boots and a feathered hat walking upright through Sherwood was not a thing that went unnoticed for long. Little John and Will Scarlet came upon him first, and they were as astonished to meet a talking cat as they had been, only days before, to meet a walking scarecrow, and they brought him back to the great oak to meet Robin Hood, wondering aloud what strange season this was that sent such curious travellers into the greenwood one after another. And so Puss in Boots came before Robin Hood and swept off his feathered hat, and made a bow so low and so elegant that the feather brushed the forest floor, and introduced himself with all his considerable charm. And Robin Hood, who had taken an instant liking to the humble Scarecrow, took an equal and opposite liking to the bold and boastful cat, for the 2 of them were as different as could be, and Robin had a warm place in his heart for both humility and boldness when they came honestly. Puss told the outlaws the whole of the miller's sorry tale, the greedy Sir Aldous Grim, the invented debt, the threat to seize the mill and turn the honest family out into the cold, and as he told it, the faces of the outlaws grew dark, for this was exactly the sort of cruelty that had driven every one of them into the greenwood in the first place. Robin Hood declared at once that they would help, and that Sir Aldous Grim would not have his way, not while there were free men in Sherwood to stand against him. The outlaws cheered and reached for their bows, for their first thought, as it always was of a bold rescue, of storming the manor house and setting things right by force. But Puss in Boots held up a paw and begged them, most courteously, to wait a moment before they went charging off, for he had learned in his long career that force was very often the worst way to deal with a powerful man, and cleverness very often the best. Sir Aldous Grim, he pointed out, had the law on his side, crooked as that law was, and he had guards and walls and the sheriff's favour, and if the outlaws simply attacked him, they would be branded worse outlaws than ever, and the poor miller might be blamed for their deeds and suffer all the more. No, said Puss, this was a puzzle to be solved by wit, not won by force, and a proud and greedy man was best undone, not by an arrow, but by his own greed and his own pride, gently and cleverly turned against him. Now it was just at this moment, as the outlaws were quieting down, to consider the cat's words, that the Scarecrow, who had been sitting, as he always did, at the edge of the gathering, listening far more than he spoke, made his first quiet remark. He said in his soft and hesitant way that he thought the clever cat was quite right, and that it seemed to him that a man who was greedy enough to invent a false debt in order to steal a mill was a man who could very likely be led into a trap by that same greed, if only the right bait were dangled before him. He was sorry, he added, if that was a foolish thing to say, for he had straw for brains and could not really think at all. There was a silence in the greenwood then, for the Scarecrow had, in a few soft and humble words, said something rather profound, and everyone had felt it. Puss in Boots turned his green eyes upon the strange straw creature with a new and sharpened interest, for Puss knew cleverness when he heard it, being so clever himself, and he had just heard it in the last place he would have looked, from a scarecrow who insisted he had no brains. And Puss said so plainly and admiringly, declaring that the scarecrow had put his paw, or rather his straw finger, exactly upon the heart of the matter, and that this was precisely the plan, to use the greedy lord's own greed as the bait in a trap of their own devising. And the scarecrow was so surprised and so pleased to be praised by the cleverest cat in England that he could hardly speak, and a little straw came loose from his collar, and everyone laughed warmly and kindly, and in that moment the three unlikely friends were truly made. For that is how it happened that the gentle scarecrow, the bold outlaw, and the clever cat came together, three creatures who could hardly have been more different, bound now by a common cause and a growing fondness for one another. The scarecrow had his quiet, clear-seeing wisdom, which found the simple truth at the heart of any tangle. Puss in Boots had his bold and dazzling cleverness, his gift for schemes and disguises, and turning a proud man's pride against him. And Robin Hood had his courage and his good name among the poor, and his loyal company of strong and willing men to carry any plan through to the end. Each of them had something the others lacked, and together they were a match for any greedy lord in England, though not one of them could have done it alone. They sat together long into that night beneath the great oak in the flickering firelight, and they began to make their plan. Puss in Boots laid out the bones of it, his eyes gleaming with mischief, and Robin Hood added the strength of it, and the scarecrow gently and humbly again and again saw the small flaw or the missing piece that the others had overlooked, and smoothed it and mended it until the plan was whole and sound. And Friar Tuck brought them roasted chestnuts and warm cider, and Little John built the fire high, and the whole company of outlaws gathered close to listen, and it was, all in all, one of the merriest and most hopeful nights the greenwood had known in many a long month. For there is nothing so warming to the heart as good friends gathered together against a common wrong, with a clever plan taking shape between them, and a good deed waiting to be done. The shape of the plan. The plan they made together was a thing of beauty, and it was built, as Puss in Boots had insisted, upon the greedy lord's own greed, which is the surest foundation for the undoing of a greedy man. I will tell you the shape of it now, though the best part will be in the watching of it unfold, for a plan on paper is never so fine as a plan in action. The heart of it was this. Sir Aldous Grim wanted the mill because the mill made money, and he was a man who could think of nothing but money, and who believed, as such men do, that everyone else in the world thought of nothing but money either. And so, Puss reasoned, if they could make Sir Aldous believe that there was somewhere nearby a far greater fortune to be had, some prize so rich and so dazzling that it made the poor little mill look like nothing at all, then his greed would seize upon that greater prize and forget the smaller one entirely. They would dangle before him a treasure so tempting that he would drop the mill from his grasping hands to reach for it, and in reaching for it he would fall into a trap of his own making and undo himself and free the miller's family without a single arrow being loosed. But what treasure could they dangle before a lord who already had a manor house and lands and wealth? It would have to be something extraordinary, something worth far more than any mill, something that would set even a rich man's greedy heart to pounding. And here was where the cleverness of Puss in Boots and the quiet wisdom of the Scarecrow wove together most beautifully. For Puss proposed that they should invent a treasure, a great and fabulous one, and make Sir Aldous believe in it utterly, and lead him by his own greed to a place of their choosing, far from the mill, where they might deal with him as they saw fit. And the Scarecrow, thinking his slow, careful thoughts, suggested gently that the treasure ought not to be gold, for gold was common, and a rich man had seen much gold, but something rarer and stranger and more wonderful, something a proud lord would give anything to possess simply for the glory of possessing it. And so between them they invented the legend of the silver stag of Sherwood, It was to be a deer, they decided, but no ordinary deer, a great and ancient stag with a hide of pure shining silver and antlers of gold, a creature out of the oldest legends of the forest, said to appear only once in 100 years, and said to grant untold fortune and long life to whoever could capture it. There was no such creature, of course. It was a story spun out of nothing, out of straw and cat's wit and firelight. But it was exactly the kind of story that a greedy and superstitious lord would want, with all his grasping heart, to believe, and that was all that mattered. They would let the rumour of the silver stag reach Sir Aldous Grim, whispered and hinted at from several directions at once, so that it seemed to come not from any single source, but from the very air of the countryside, as true legends do. They would let him hear that the stag had been sighted deep in Sherwood, and that it was worth 100 mills, 1,000, a fortune beyond counting. And then, when his greed was thoroughly kindled, when he could think of nothing but the silver stag, and could not sleep for dreaming of it, they would lead him into the forest to hunt it, deep into the greenwood, onto the outlaw's own ground, where Robin Hood and his men held all the advantages, and Sir Aldous held none. And there, gently and cleverly, they would spring their trap. Now Puss in Boots, being a cat of great theatrical flair, was to play the leading role in the deception, for he was a master of disguise and of bold performance. He would present himself at the manor house in the guise of a great travelling personage, a huntsman and adventurer of distant fame who had come from far away in pursuit of the legendary silver stag, and who could, for a consideration, lead the lord to it. This would make the legend real in Sir Aldous' mind, for a thing that a stranger has travelled far to seek must surely be worth the seeking, and it would put Puss himself in the position of the guide, so that he might lead the greedy lord exactly where they wished him to go. The Scarecrow's part was quieter, but no less important, for it was the Scarecrow who would watch and think and foresee the flaws in the scheme before they could undo it. And Robin Hood's part, and the part of all his merry men, was to prepare the greenwood for the lord's coming, to set the stage of the forest for the final act of the play, so that when Sir Aldous Grim came hunting his silver stag, he would find instead exactly the reckoning he deserved. Little John and Will Scarlet and Much and all the rest listened to the unfolding plan with growing delight, for they loved nothing so well as a bold scheme to bring a proud man low, and this was as fine a one as they had ever heard. There was much to prepare, and they set about it with a will. Friar Tuck, who knew everyone in the district and could go where the outlaws could not, was sent to begin the careful whispering of the legend in the alehouses and the markets, so that it might make its slow way to the ears of the manor house. Will Scarlet, who was quick and clever and could make himself look like anyone, was to help Puss with his disguise and his grand performance. And the Scarecrow, meanwhile, sat by the fire and thought, turning the whole plan over and over in his careful mind, looking for the loose threads that might unravel it, so that they might be tucked safely away before the greedy lord could pull upon them. For the Scarecrow understood better than any of them that a plan is a fragile thing, and that the difference between a scheme that succeeds and one that ends in disaster very often lies in some small detail that no one thought to consider. And so he considered them all one by one, slowly and patiently, and again he found some small thing that the bolder and quicker minds had overlooked. He pointed out that Sir Aldous would surely bring guards, and that they must plan for them. He pointed out that the lord would be suspicious of a treasure that came too easily, and that Puss must seem reluctant to share it, so that Sir Aldous would want it all the more. He pointed out a dozen such things, gently and humbly, always sorry to be a bother, always sure that he was only a brainless scarecrow, and every single one of them made the plan stronger and surer. And Puss in Boots, watching him, marvelled, for the cat had never in his life met anyone whose mind worked so quietly and so well, and he told the Scarecrow so, and the Scarecrow shed a little straw in his happy embarrassment, as he always did. When all was ready and the legend of the silver stag had been whispered into the countryside until it hung in the very air, Puss in Boots put on his finest airs and his boldest manner and set off for the manor house of Sir Aldous Grim to begin the great deception. He had made himself very grand indeed for the occasion. Will Scarlet had helped him to brush his grey fur until it shone, and to polish his tall boots until they gleamed, and to set his feathered hat at its most dashing angle, and Puss carried himself with such an air of importance and distinction that no one who saw him coming could have doubted for a moment that here was a personage of the very greatest consequence. The manor house of Sir Aldous Grim was a cold and unlovely place, for all its size and grandeur, for a house takes on something of the nature of the one who lives in it, and Sir Aldous was a cold and unlovely man. It sat upon a hill overlooking the country he squeezed for his profit, grey and hard and unwelcoming, with high walls and narrow windows and a great iron gate. But Puss in Boots walked up to that gate as boldly as if he owned it, and announced himself in a great and ringing voice as a huntsman and adventurer of world renown, come on a matter of the very highest importance to speak with the lord of the manor. And such was his confidence, and so grand was his manner, that the astonished guards, who had never seen a talking cat in boots and did not know at all what to make of him, let him through, and brought him before their master. Sir Aldous Grim received the strange visitor in his great cold hall, seated in a high carved chair like a throne, and he looked down his long nose at the cat with suspicion and contempt, for he was a man who despised everyone and trusted no one. But Puss in Boots was entirely undaunted, and he swept off his feathered hat and made his most magnificent bow, and began at once upon the performance of his life. He spoke of far countries and famous hunts and great deeds done in distant lands, weaving a tale of himself so grand and so dazzling that Sir Aldous, in spite of himself, began to listen. And then, when he judged the moment ripe, Puss came to the heart of it and lowered his voice and spoke, as if in the greatest confidence, of the silver stag of Sherwood. He had travelled half the world, Puss said, in pursuit of this one legendary creature, for it was said that the silver stag appeared but once in 100 years, and that whoever captured it would gain a fortune beyond the dreams of kings and a long and glorious life besides. And now, at last, after all his long searching, he had tracked the creature here to the forest of Sherwood, upon Sir Aldous Grim's very doorstep. He had seen its silver hide gleaming among the trees with his own eyes. He knew where it could be found, but it was a hunt too great for one huntsman alone, however famous, and so he had come, most graciously, to offer the noble lord of the manor a share in the greatest prize in all the world, if only the lord would lend his aid in the capturing of it. Now Sir Aldous Grim was a greedy man, and Puss had laid his bait most expertly, and the lord's cold eyes began, in spite of all his suspicion, to gleam. A fortune beyond the dreams of kings, a creature of pure silver and gold, long life and untold wealth, there for the taking, in his own forest, brought to his own door by this strange and grand visitor. It was exactly the kind of prize that a man like Sir Aldous could not resist, for it appealed to every greedy and grasping impulse in his cold heart, and it appealed as well to his vanity, for he imagined himself the possessor of such a wonder, the envy of every lord in England. He tried to hide his eagerness, for he was a suspicious man and did not wish to seem too easily led, but Puss in Boots, who could read a greedy heart the way you or I might read a book, saw the hook go home, and knew that the greatest lord in the district had just been caught as neatly as a mouse. But Puss was far too clever to let it seem too easy, for the Scarecrow had warned him of exactly this, that a treasure won without effort is a treasure that rouses suspicion. And so, when Sir Aldous, trying to sound careless, said that he supposed he might be persuaded to join such a hunt, Puss in Boots grew suddenly reluctant. He said that on second thought perhaps the noble lord was too busy and too important for such an arduous venture, and that perhaps he ought to seek another partner, some other great personage, who might value the opportunity more highly. And this, of course, drove Sir Aldous nearly frantic with greed, for there is nothing that makes a greedy man want a thing so badly as the fear that someone else might have it, and now he found himself in the strange position of having to persuade the cat to let him join, and pressing his eagerness upon the very creature he had meant to hold at arm's length. Puss allowed himself with a great show of reluctance to be persuaded, and the two of them agreed that the hunt for the silver stag would take place 3 days hence, deep in the forest of Sherwood, at a place that Puss would show him. And Puss in Boots took his leave of the manor house and went back into the greenwood, well satisfied, for the trap was baited and set, and the greedy lord had walked straight into the first part of it as though he had been led by the nose, which, in a manner of speaking, he had. Preparing the greenwood. Now there were 3 days before the hunt, and they were busy and hopeful days in the greenwood, for there was a great deal to prepare, and the whole company of outlaws threw themselves into it with a will. The plan was that Sir Aldous Grim, led by Puss in Boots, would come deep into Sherwood in pursuit of the silver stag, and that when he was well and truly lost in the heart of the forest, far from his manor and his power, the trap would be sprung. But a trap of that kind must be prepared with the greatest care, and it was the Scarecrow most of all who saw to it that every part of it was made ready. The chosen place was a wide green glade, deep in the forest, ringed all about with ancient trees and thick with fern and thicket, a place where the outlaws could hide themselves unseen among the leaves and yet see everything that passed below. It was there that Puss would lead the greedy lord, on the promise that the silver stag was often seen to graze in that glade at dusk. And it was there that Robin Hood and his men would be waiting, hidden all around, ready to spring out at the appointed moment and confront Sir Aldous Grim upon their own ground, where his guards and his walls and his crooked law could not help him at all. But the Scarecrow, thinking his slow, careful thoughts, saw that it would not be enough merely to leap out and confront the lord, for a confrontation could turn to a fight, and a fight could turn out any number of ways, and the miller's family might still suffer for it in the end. "No," said the Scarecrow gently, "the trap must do more than catch the lord. It must catch him in his own greed and his own wickedness so thoroughly, and before so many witnesses, that he could never again threaten the miller or any other poor family, and that he would be shamed and humbled and made to give back everything he had wrongly taken. It was not enough to frighten him. They must undo him cleanly and completely, in a way that even the crooked law could not overturn. And so, over those 3 days, the Scarecrow shaped the plan into something finer and cleverer than any of them had first imagined. He proposed that they should arrange for Sir Aldous Grim to be brought, by his own greed, to confess his wickedness aloud, before witnesses he did not know were listening, and to be caught in the very act of his greed, so that his own words and his own deeds would be the trap that held him. He proposed that they should invite to the glade in secret certain honest and respected people of the district, a village elder or two, the good priest of the nearby church, perhaps even someone connected to the sheriff who was not entirely crooked, so that when Sir Aldous revealed his true nature, as the Scarecrow was sure he would, there would be witnesses of standing to see it, whose word could not be dismissed. And the outlaws marvelled at this, for it was a subtler and a surer plan than any of them would have thought of, and it had come, once again, from the quiet Scarecrow, who insisted he had no brains at all. They set about the preparations. Robin Hood himself went, in disguise, to speak with the honest people of the district, and to invite them, in the greatest secrecy, to be present in the greenwood on the appointed evening, promising them that they would witness the undoing of the man who had oppressed them all, and asking them to trust him. And such was the love and the trust that the common people bore for Robin Hood, that they agreed, one and all, and promised to come and to say nothing of it to anyone. Little John and Will Scarlet and the others made ready the glade, arranging the hiding places among the ferns and the trees, and preparing certain clever effects that would help to bring the legend of the silver stag to life at the crucial moment, for a hunt must have a quarry, or at least the seeming of one. And here the outlaws had a merry time indeed, for they set about creating, out of cloth and paint and cleverness, the illusion of the silver stag itself. They could not make a real creature of silver and gold, of course, but they could make something that might, glimpsed for a moment through the trees in the failing light of dusk, pass well enough for the legendary beast. They fashioned a shape and covered it in bright, polished stuff that would catch and scatter the last light of the day, and they arranged it upon a hidden line among the trees so that it might be made to move just once, just for a moment, at exactly the right time, and then to vanish again. It would not bear close looking at, but it would not need to. It needed only to be seen for an instant in the dusk by a greedy man who desperately wanted to believe in it, and greed and hope would do the rest, filling in with imagination all that the eye could not quite make out. The Scarecrow watched all these preparations with his quiet button eyes and thought about them, and mended them where they needed mending, and worried gently over every detail. For he had taken it upon himself, without ever quite deciding to be the one who saw that nothing went wrong, and the outlaws had come to rely upon him for exactly that. Whenever a difficulty arose, they brought it to the Scarecrow, and the Scarecrow would think about it slowly and carefully, and very often he would see the answer. And bit by bit, over those 3 busy days, the strange straw creature who had believed himself the most brainless thing in all the world found himself becoming the very heart and mind of the whole great scheme, trusted and valued and loved by all the company, though he could hardly believe it was so. The Scarecrow and the Cat by the fire. On the night before the hunt, when all the preparations were made, and there was nothing left to do but wait, the Scarecrow and Puss in Boots sat together by the last of the fire after the others had gone to their rest, and they talked as friends do on the eve of a great endeavour. And it was a conversation that the Scarecrow would remember for a long time afterward, for it was then that the clever cat said something that began at last to change the way the Scarecrow saw himself. Puss in Boots, you see, was a great one for talking, and he had been talking cheerfully for some while about his own many cleverness and his own many triumphs, for Puss was never shy about his own accomplishments, and he told again the tale of how he had won a castle and a fortune and a princess for his old master with nothing but his wits. But then Puss grew quieter and more thoughtful than was his habit, and he looked at the Scarecrow across the dying fire, and he said a thing that surprised them both. He said that in all his long and clever career, in all his schemes and disguises and daring deceptions, he had never once met anyone whose mind he admired as much as he admired the Scarecrow's, and that he, Puss in Boots, the cleverest cat in all of England, was not ashamed to say that the strange straw creature beside him was cleverer still. The Scarecrow was so astonished by this that for a moment he could not speak at all, and a good deal of straw came loose from various parts of him in his agitation. He protested, of course, as he always did, that it could not possibly be true, that he had straw for brains and could not really think, that any wisdom he seemed to have was surely an accident, and that Puss was far too kind. But Puss in Boots would not have it. He told the Scarecrow seriously and warmly that he had watched him closely over the past days, and that the Scarecrow's mind was a rare and wonderful thing, quiet and clear and deep, and that the reason the Scarecrow could see so truly was the very reason he thought himself a fool, for he was humble, and humility clears the eyes as surely as pride clouds them. The Scarecrow saw the world plainly, said Puss, because he did not clutter his seeing with any wish to seem clever, and that was a wisdom finer and rarer than all of Puss's dazzling schemes put together. And then Puss said the thing that struck the deepest, and that the Scarecrow turned over in his mind for many nights afterward. He said that a brain, in the end, was not a thing you were given, all finished and complete, but a thing you made, out of watching and thinking and caring, and that the Scarecrow had made himself one of the finest brains in England out of nothing but attention and good sense and a kind heart, and that this was a far greater thing than to have simply been born clever. It was one thing, said Puss, to be given a sharp wit, as he himself had been. It was another thing entirely to build a wise mind out of straw by sheer patient care, and to do it while believing all the while that you were a fool. That, said Puss in Boots, was the most admirable thing he had ever seen, and the Scarecrow ought to be proud of it. The Scarecrow did not know what to say to this, for no one had ever spoken to him so before, and he was not at all sure that he believed it. But something in him had shifted just a little, some small, settled certainty that he was worthless, and brainless had loosened its grip ever so slightly, and for the first time in his long life upon the pole and off it, the Scarecrow allowed himself to wonder whether he might, after all, be something more than a fool. It was only a small wondering, and it did not undo all at once the belief of a lifetime. But it was a beginning, and beginnings, as we know, are how all the best things start. And the two friends sat together by the dying fire a while longer, the clever cat and the wise Scarecrow, in a warm and companionable silence, until the fire burned low, and it was time to rest before the great day. The day of the hunt dawned grey and still and full of that hushed expectancy that comes before a great event, when the very air seems to be holding its breath. The outlaws were up before the light, moving quietly through the forest to take their places in the glade, hiding themselves among the ferns and in the branches of the great trees, so still and so well concealed in their Lincoln green that you might have walked the whole length of the glade and never known that 50 men lay hidden all around you. The honest witnesses of the district, the village elders, and the good priest and the others were brought in secret by Little John to a hidden place at the edge of the glade, from which they could see and hear everything that passed without being seen themselves. And the clever illusion of the silver stag was set upon its hidden line among the trees, ready to be shown for its single crucial moment. The Scarecrow, who could not fight, and would only be in the way of the outlaws, was given a hiding place of his own among the ferns close by the centre of the glade, from which he might watch the whole of the plan unfold and, if anything should go wrong, might perhaps see the fixing of it in time. For they had all come to rely upon the Scarecrow's quiet, clear sight, and Robin Hood himself had said that he would feel easier knowing the Scarecrow's careful eyes were watching over the whole affair. And so the Scarecrow settled himself among the ferns, his button eyes fixed upon the glade, and waited and thought and worried gently, as was his way. Puss in Boots, meanwhile, had gone to the manor house to fetch the greedy lord, dressed in all his finest and playing his grand part to the hilt. And in the middle of the morning the sound of horses and voices came through the forest, and Puss appeared at the edge of the glade, leading Sir Aldous Grim and a handful of his guards deep into the greenwood. The greedy lord was mounted upon a fine horse, and dressed in rich hunting clothes, and his cold face was flushed with eagerness and greed, for he had thought of nothing but the silver stag for 3 days, and could scarcely contain his excitement now that the hunt was at hand. He had brought 4 guards with him, armed men, just as the Scarecrow had foreseen, but 4 guards, deep in Sherwood, surrounded unknowing by 50 hidden outlaws, were no threat at all, and served only to make the trap the more complete. Puss in Boots led them into the glade with a great show of caution and secrecy, whispering that they must be very quiet, for the silver stag was a shy and wary creature, and would flee at the least disturbance. He told Sir Aldous that the stag was often seen to come to this very glade in the failing light of evening, to graze upon the sweet grass there, and that if they concealed themselves and waited patiently, they might hope to see it and to capture it before the day was done. And Sir Aldous Grim, greedy and impatient though he was, made himself be quiet and be patient, for the prize was too great to risk by any carelessness, and he settled down to wait, his cold eyes darting eagerly about the glade, searching the shadows beneath the trees for the first gleam of silver. And now the long, slow waiting began, and it was a strange and quiet time, the greedy lord and his guards watching the glade with breathless greed, and all around them, unseen, 50 outlaws and a handful of honest witnesses, and 1 straw Scarecrow watching the greedy lord with equal attention. The afternoon wore slowly on. The light began at last to fail, and the shadows beneath the trees grew long and blue, and the glade filled with the soft grey-gold light of a forest at dusk. And Puss in Boots, judging that the moment had come, gave the tiny signal that had been agreed upon, and far across the glade, among the trees, the illusion of the silver stag was made to move. It was only for a moment, and only a glimpse, exactly as they had planned. Through the trees at the far side of the glade, in the last gleam of the failing light, there passed a shape, a great shape, that caught the light and threw it back in a flash of shining silver, there and then gone, vanishing again into the shadows of the wood. It was the barest glimpse, a single instant, but it was enough, for Sir Aldous Grim had been staring into those shadows for hours, with all his greedy heart yearning to see exactly that, and greed and hope filled in all the rest. He saw the silver stag of Sherwood, or believed he saw it, which in that moment came to the same thing, and he leapt to his feet with a strangled cry of triumph and greed, all his caution forgotten, and pointed with a trembling hand at the place where the shining shape had vanished. The trap is sprung. Now everything happened very quickly, and yet the Scarecrow, watching from among the ferns, seemed to see it all slowly and clearly, each moment following upon the last, exactly as they had planned it. Sir Aldous Grim, beside himself with greed at the sight of the silver stag, forgot every caution and every pretence, and showed himself at last for exactly what he was. He shouted at his guards to go after the creature, to capture it at any cost, and when Puss in Boots, playing his part, cautioned him that they had agreed to share the prize, the greedy lord rounded upon the cat with his cold face twisted in a snarl, and revealed the true blackness of his heart. He would share nothing, Sir Aldous Grim declared. The silver stag was his, all his, and he would have every last gleaming inch of it, and if the cat thought to claim any part of that fortune, the cat was very much mistaken. He had never meant to share it, he sneered, not for a moment. He had meant all along to let the strange cat lead him to the prize, and then to take the whole of it for himself, and to be rid of the cat besides. And warming to his own wickedness now, sure that he was alone in the deep forest with none but his own guards to hear him, Sir Aldous Grim went further still, and boasted openly of all his crimes, as wicked men so often will, when they believe themselves unheard. He boasted of how he had squeezed the poor people of his lands until they bled, and laughed at how easy it had been. He boasted of the false debt he had invented to steal the miller's mill, and of how he meant to turn the honest family out into the cold, and take their home for his own profit, and of how there was nothing they could do to stop him, for the law was his, and the sheriff was his, and the poor were helpless before him. He boasted of a dozen other cruelties besides, cheating this widow and robbing that orphan, and he laughed his cold laugh over every one of them, standing there in the dusk of the glade, certain that no one heard him but his own hired men. And all the while, hidden among the ferns and the trees all around him, the honest witnesses of the district heard every word, and the good priest, and the village elders, and Robin Hood and all his men, and the Scarecrow with his quiet button eyes. The greedy lord had been led by his own greed to confess the whole of his wickedness aloud before more witnesses than he could dream of, exactly as the Scarecrow had foreseen. The trap was sprung, and Sir Aldous Grim had sprung it himself with his own greedy tongue. And now Robin Hood gave the signal, and the greenwood came alive. All around the glade, from the ferns and the thickets and the branches of the great trees, the outlaws rose up in their Lincoln green, 50 strong, their bows drawn and their arrows ready, and they stepped out into the open on every side, ringing the astonished lord and his 4 guards completely about. Sir Aldous Grim spun round and round, his mouth falling open, his cold face draining of its colour, as he understood, slowly and horribly, that he was surrounded, that he was trapped, that the deep and lonely forest in which he had thought himself so safe was in fact full of the very outlaws he had heard so much of and feared so little. His 4 guards, seeing themselves so hopelessly outnumbered, dropped their weapons at once and raised their hands, for they were only hired men, and had no wish to die for a master they did not love. And Robin Hood stepped forward into the centre of the glade, tall and calm and terrible in his quiet way, and faced the greedy lord, and told him that his wickedness was at an end. He told him that every cruel word he had just boasted had been heard by the honest people of the district, who now stepped forth from their hiding place at the edge of the glade, so that Sir Aldous might see them, the priest and the elders and the rest, their faces grave and stern. He told him that his crimes were known now and witnessed by people whose word even the crooked sheriff could not dismiss, and that the game was up. And Sir Aldous Grim, looking from the outlaws to the witnesses to the calm, hard face of Robin Hood, understood that he was utterly undone, caught in a trap of his own greed, with no wall and no guard, and no crooked law to save him, and the cold, proud strength went out of him all at once, and he stood there in the dusk of the glade, a beaten and a frightened man. The reckoning of Sir Aldous Grim. What followed was not cruel, for Robin Hood was not a cruel man, and neither were his friends, and there is no true justice in cruelty. But it was a reckoning, full and complete, and Sir Aldous Grim was made to answer for all that he had done. Robin Hood told him plainly that he had two choices before him. He might refuse to make amends, in which case the honest witnesses would carry the tale of his confession to every corner of the land, to the sheriff and beyond, to powers even the sheriff answered to, and Sir Aldous would be stripped of his lands and his title, and cast down into ruin and disgrace. Or he might make amends fully and freely, giving back all that he had wrongly taken, and swearing to deal honestly henceforth, in which case his confession would be kept quiet, and he would be allowed to keep his position, chastened and watched, so long as he never again oppressed the people in his care. It was a fair choice, and a merciful one, far more merciful than Sir Aldous deserved, and the greedy lord, for all his wickedness, was not a fool, and he knew when he was beaten. He chose, of course, to make amends, for the alternative was ruin, and a greedy man clings to what he has above all things. And so there in the glade, in the last of the dusk, with the outlaws and the witnesses all looking on, Sir Aldous Grim was made to swear a solemn oath. He swore to forgive the false debt he had invented against the miller, and to trouble the family no more, and to let them keep their mill in peace forever. He swore to give back all that he had wrongly taken from the poor of his lands, every unjust rent and every cruel tax, and to deal fairly and honestly with everyone in his care from that day forward, and he swore it before the priest and before the elders and before all the company, so that the oath was binding and witnessed and could never be undone. And then Robin Hood, to make quite sure of it, told Sir Aldous Grim that he and his men would be watching always from the greenwood, and that the honest people of the district would be watching too, and that if ever the Lord broke his oath, if ever he returned to his cruel and greedy ways, the tale of his confession in the glade would be told far and wide, and his ruin would follow swift and sure. And Sir Aldous Grim, humbled and frightened and beaten, believed him, for he had seen now what he had never troubled to see before, that the poor he had despised were not so helpless as he had thought, and that there were forces in the world, in the greenwood, and in the hearts of honest people that even a powerful lord could not simply trample down. He was allowed to go at last back to his cold manor house with his 4 sheepish guards, a changed and a chastened man, and though I cannot tell you that his heart was made good all at once, for hearts are not so easily mended, I can tell you that he kept his oath from fear, if not from goodness, and that the people of his lands were never again squeezed and bled as they had been, and that was a very great deal indeed. As for the silver stag of Sherwood, Sir Aldous never learned that it had been nothing but cloth and paint and cleverness upon a hidden line, and perhaps that was for the best, for a man may as well be humbled by a legend as by anything else. To the end of his days he half believed that he had truly seen a creature of silver and gold pass through the trees at dusk, and that it had been a kind of omen, a warning sent to turn him from his wicked ways, and if that belief helped to keep him honest, then the illusion had done more good than any real treasure ever could have. And the outlaws, gathering up their clever contrivance after the Lord had gone, laughed long and warmly over how the greatest and greediest man in all the district had been brought low by a scarecrow's wisdom, a cat's cunning, and a deer made of old cloth. There was great joy at the mill by the stream when the news was brought that very night, for Robin Hood himself, with the Scarecrow and Puss in Boots, and a good company of his men, went straight away through the dark forest to carry the good tidings to the miller's family. They found the family gathered as before around their small fire, sunk in fear and sorrow, for it was drawing near the end of the month, and they had given up all hope, and were only waiting now for the terrible day when Sir Aldous Grim would come to turn them out of their home forever. And into this sadness came Robin Hood, striding through the door with a great warm smile, followed by a cat in fine boots, and a scarecrow of straw, and a company of outlaws in Lincoln Green, and the news that all was well. It took the poor family some little while to understand and to believe it, for they had been afraid for so long that hope came slowly. But Robin Hood told them the whole tale of the invented legend and the greedy lord's greed, of the hunt in the glade, and the confession and the oath, and Puss in Boots acted out the finest parts of it with such spirit and such flair that the children began to laugh, and then the whole family was laughing and weeping at once, and the miller, Godfrey, seized Robin Hood's hand and could not let it go for gratitude. The false debt was forgiven, the mill was theirs and would stay theirs forever. Sir Aldous Grim would trouble them no more. The nightmare was ended, and they were safe, and the relief of it was almost more than the poor family could bear. And when the miller learned that it was the strange scarecrow and the clever cat, as much as the famous outlaw who had saved his family, he turned to them with tears in his honest eyes and thanked them from the very bottom of his heart. And the miller's wife embraced them both, straw and fur alike, and the children clung to them and would not let them go. And the Scarecrow, who had spent his whole life believing himself a useless and brainless thing, found himself hugged and thanked and wept over by a family whose home and whole world he had helped to save. And something happened in his straw-stuffed heart in that moment that had never happened before. He understood all at once and past all doubting that he had done a good and important thing, and that he was not useless at all, and that a creature who could help to save a family from ruin was a creature of real worth in the world, whatever he was made of. And it was the sweetest feeling he had ever known. They stayed at the mill late into that night, and it became a celebration, for the miller's wife, in her joy and gratitude, set about at once to feed her rescuers, and though the family was poor, they gave freely of what little they had, which is the truest kind of generosity there is. And Friar Tuck, who had come along, added to the feast from the outlaw's own stores, and soon the little mill was warm and bright and full of good food and good cheer and the sound of laughter and song. Little John told grand tales, and Will Scarlet sang merry songs, and Puss in Boots strutted and boasted and made everyone laugh with his outrageous stories, and Robin Hood sat by the fire with the miller's youngest child asleep in his lap, content as any man in England. And the Scarecrow sat in the midst of it all, warm and happy and loved, and thought that he had never in all his life imagined that such happiness was possible, and that the great wind that had torn him from his pole and carried him away had been, though he could not have known it at the time, the greatest good fortune that had ever befallen him. What the Scarecrow learned. I want to pause here in our tale in the warmth of that happy night at the mill, to tell you of the change that had come over the Scarecrow, for it is the truest heart of the whole story, and I would not have you miss it. When first the great wind had set him down in Sherwood, the Scarecrow had believed himself the most brainless and useless creature in all the world, a thing of straw, fit only to stand upon a pole and frighten crows, worth nothing and good for nothing. And now, only a little while later, he sat in a warm mill among dear friends, having helped through his own quiet wisdom to save an honest family from ruin, thanked and loved and valued by all. And the difference lay not in the Scarecrow himself, for he was the same creature of straw and cloth he had always been. The difference lay only in what he had come to understand about himself, and that had made all the difference in the world. For the Scarecrow had learned over those days in the greenwood a thing that many people go their whole lives without ever learning, which is that they are worth far more than they believe. He had been so sure of his own foolishness, so certain that his straw-stuffed head could hold no wisdom, that he had never once given himself the chance to see how clearly and how wisely he truly saw. It had taken the outlaws and the clever cat and the saving of the miller's family to show him the truth about himself, to hold up a mirror in which he could see at last not the fool he had always believed himself to be, but the wise and gentle and valuable soul he truly was. And once he had seen it, he could never quite unsee it, and it changed him, not into someone new, but into more truly himself, which is the only real change there ever is. And here is the thing that Puss in Boots had told him by the fire, and that the Scarecrow now understood in his very straw, that his wisdom and his foolishness were not two different things but one and the same. It was precisely because he had believed himself a fool that he had become wise, for believing himself foolish had made him humble, and humble enough to listen, and humble enough to watch, and humble enough to think slowly and carefully, and never to trust too much in his own cleverness. The proud man, sure of his own wits, rushes ahead and stumbles. The humble Scarecrow, sure of his own foolishness, went slowly and carefully and saw the truth. His humility had been the making of his wisdom, and this is one of the deepest and gentlest secrets in all the world, that the surest sign of a wise heart is very often the belief that one is not wise at all. The Scarecrow thought about all of this in his slow and careful way through that happy night and for many nights afterward, and though he never became proud, for pride was not in his gentle nature, he did become, at last, content. He stopped believing himself worthless. He came to know that he had a place in the world and friends who loved him and a wisdom worth the sharing, and that was enough, more than enough, for so humble and so kind a heart. And if you should ever, on some dark night, find yourself believing that you are foolish or useless or worth very little in the world, I hope you will remember the Scarecrow of Sherwood, and remember that the ones who believe such things about themselves are very often, like him, the wisest and the kindest and the most valuable souls of all, if only they could see it. For very often the belief itself is the proof of its own untruth, and the humble heart that fears it is worthless is precisely the heart that is worth the most. Now the days that followed were golden ones in the greenwood, some of the happiest that the Scarecrow, or indeed any of them, had ever known. The miller's family was safe, and the greedy lord was humbled, and there was nothing pressing to be done, and so the three friends and the whole company of outlaws simply enjoyed one another's company in the beautiful autumn forest, walking the woodland paths and gathering the last fruits of the season, and sitting long in the evenings beneath the great oak, telling tales and singing songs. The Scarecrow was happier than he had ever dreamed of being, and Puss in Boots, who was a restless soul, found for once that he was in no hurry at all to wander off in search of new adventures, so pleasant was the company he had found. And Robin Hood and his men had taken both the strange creatures so thoroughly into their hearts that it seemed as though the three friends might simply stay in Sherwood forever, and perhaps they might have. But there came an evening when the Scarecrow, sitting quietly by the fire as was his habit, fell to thinking about his cornfield in the flat green country far away, and about the crows who had been his friends there, and about the empty pole where he had used to stand. And a small sadness crept into his happiness, a gentle wistfulness, for even in the midst of all his newfound joy, a part of him wondered about the home he had left behind, and whether he ought not, some day, to find his way back to it. He had never meant to leave it. The wind had simply taken him. And though he loved the greenwood and his friends there with all his heart, there was in him, as there is in most creatures, a quiet tug toward the place he had come from, the place that was, for better or worse, his own. He spoke of this, hesitantly, one evening, to Robin Hood and Puss in Boots, for he had learned by now that his friends valued his thoughts and would not laugh at him, and he found that his friends understood, for the tug toward home is a thing that nearly everyone feels, and there is no shame in it. But it was Puss in Boots, ever clever, who saw the matter most clearly, and who gently helped the Scarecrow to understand his own heart. Home, said Puss, was a curious thing, and it was not always the place a creature had come from. Sometimes a creature's true home was not where he had begun, but where he had found the people who loved him and the work that gave his life meaning, and sometimes a creature had to travel very far from the place of his beginning in order to find, at last, the place where he truly belonged. And the Scarecrow thought about this in his slow, careful way, and he understood that Puss had touched upon something true. His cornfield had been the place of his beginning, and he had been fond of it in his way, but he had not, if he was honest, been truly happy there. He had been lonely and idle and full of a sad belief in his own worthlessness, standing upon his pole day after day, with no friends but the passing crows and no work but the frightening of them. It was here, in the greenwood, among the outlaws and the cat and the grateful miller's family, that he had found for the first time what it was to be loved and to be useful and to belong. And so perhaps, the Scarecrow thought, his true home was not behind him after all, in the flat green country of his beginning, but here, in the greenwood, where his heart had found its place at last. A new trouble comes to the greenwood. Now it might have been that our tale would end there, with the Scarecrow settled happily in his new home, and the greedy lord humbled, and the miller's family safe, and that would have been a fine and gentle ending. But the world is not so tidy as all that, and trouble, once chased from one door, has a way of knocking at another, and it was not long before a new difficulty came to the greenwood that would test the three friends once more, and would give the Scarecrow a chance to prove, past all doubting, the wisdom he was only just beginning to believe in. It began with the arrival, one grey morning, of a frightened young woman who came stumbling into the forest in search of Robin Hood, for the tale of how the outlaws and their strange new friends had humbled. Sir Aldous Grim had spread through the district, and the poor and the troubled had begun once more to look to the greenwood for help, as they always had. This young woman was a servant from the household of the sheriff himself, and she had run away from that household in fear and in secret, and she had a tale to tell that troubled Robin Hood greatly when he heard it. For it seemed that the sheriff, that old enemy of the outlaws, had grown weary at last of Robin Hood and all his works, and had determined to be rid of him once and for all. And the sheriff had devised a cunning plan to that end, a trap far cleverer than any he had tried before. He had announced a great archery contest to be held in the town, with a prize of a golden arrow for the finest archer in all the land. And the whole purpose of this contest, the frightened servant revealed, was to draw Robin Hood out of the safety of the greenwood, for the sheriff knew that Robin was the finest archer in all of England, and knew that he would not be able to resist such a contest, and meant to seize him the moment he showed his face. The contest was a trap, and Robin Hood was the quarry, and unless he could be warned, he would walk straight into it and be taken. Robin Hood laughed when he heard this, for it was true that he loved an archery contest above almost anything, and it was true that the temptation to enter it and to win it under the very nose of the sheriff was very great. His men, knowing his love of such bold and reckless deeds, grew worried, for they feared that Robin would insist upon going despite the danger out of sheer high spirits and love of the sport. And indeed, Robin's eyes had begun to gleam with exactly that reckless light, and he had begun to say that a trap known was a trap half-sprung, and that surely a clever man might find a way to enter the contest and win the golden arrow and slip away again before the sheriff could catch him. But it was here that the Scarecrow spoke up quietly from his place by the fire, and what he said made them all fall silent and think. He said gently that he understood the temptation, and that he had no doubt Robin Hood was clever and quick enough to slip out of most traps, but he asked Robin to consider one thing. The sheriff was not a fool, whatever else he was, and the sheriff had set this trap knowing full well that Robin Hood was clever and quick. And a wise trapper, said the Scarecrow, does not set a trap that his quarry can easily escape. If the sheriff was confident enough to lay this bait, then the sheriff must believe he had some way to close the trap that Robin had not foreseen. And so, said the Scarecrow, the question was not whether Robin was clever enough to escape an ordinary trap, but what the hidden part of this trap might be, the part the sheriff was counting on, the part that Robin could not yet see. And until they knew that, it would be the height of folly to walk into it. There was a long silence in the greenwood after the Scarecrow had spoken, and Robin Hood's reckless gleam faded, and he looked at the Scarecrow with deep respect, for he saw that the straw creature had once again seen further and more clearly than any of them. It was true. He had been so caught up in the delightful challenge of the thing that he had never stopped to ask himself why the sheriff, who knew him so well, would set a trap he could so easily escape. There must be more to it. There must be some hidden jaw waiting to snap shut. And Robin Hood said as much, and thanked the Scarecrow and admitted, with a rueful laugh, that the Scarecrow had very likely just saved him from walking straight into disaster out of sheer high spirits, the Scarecrow's plan. And so once again, the three friends and the company of outlaws set their minds to a puzzle, and once again it was the quiet wisdom of the Scarecrow, joined to the bold cleverness of Puss in Boots, that found the way through. But this time it was the Scarecrow who took the lead, for the trap was a subtle one, a matter of foresight and misdirection rather than of bold action, and that was exactly the kind of problem that the Scarecrow's slow, clear mind was best suited to unravel. And Robin Hood, who had learned by now to trust the Scarecrow's judgment above his own reckless instincts, was glad to let him lead. The Scarecrow thought about the problem for a whole day and a whole night, turning it over and over in his careful mind, looking at it from every side. And what he understood was this. The sheriff expected Robin Hood to come to the contest in disguise, for Robin was famous for his disguises and would never come as himself into the very heart of the enemy's town. And so the sheriff, the Scarecrow reasoned, must have some way of seeing through disguises, some plan to test every archer, or to watch for some sign that would give Robin away no matter how he was dressed. That was the hidden jaw of the trap. The sheriff did not mean to catch a man who looked like Robin Hood. He meant to catch the finest archer in the contest, whoever he appeared to be, for he knew that Robin's skill with the bow was a thing that no disguise could hide. The moment Robin loosed his arrows and shot better than any other man alive, as he surely would, the sheriff would know him, disguise or no, and would close the trap. And once the Scarecrow had seen this, the answer came to him, simple and clear, as answers did when he had thought long enough. The trap depended upon Robin Hood, shooting like Robin Hood, better than any man alive. Very well, said the Scarecrow, then Robin Hood must not shoot like Robin Hood. He must enter the contest in disguise, yes, but more than that, he must shoot, for most of the contest, like an ordinary archer, a good archer, but not a great one, so that he drew no attention to himself and roused no suspicion. He must hang back and seem unremarkable and let others take the lead, and only at the very last, at the final shot, when the golden arrow hung in the balance, must he show his true skill and loose one perfect arrow and win, and be gone before the sheriff's slow wits could understand what had happened. The whole art of it lay in hiding his greatness until the final instant, and then revealing it for only a single heartbeat, too briefly for the trap to close. It was a clever plan and a subtle one, and it delighted Puss in Boots, who loved nothing so well as a scheme of misdirection, and who added his own flourishes to it. And it delighted Robin Hood too, for it turned the sheriff's own cleverness against him, and let Robin win the golden arrow not by brute skill alone, but by wit and self-command, which is a finer victory by far. But the Scarecrow was not finished, for he thought of everything, and he saw that even this plan had a danger in it. What if, at the final shot, Robin won, and the sheriff, realizing too late that he had been fooled, gave the order to seize the winner before he could escape? There must be a way to cover Robin's escape, a confusion, a distraction, something to fill the crucial moments, after the winning shot and before the sheriff's men could move. And here the whole company put their heads together, and between the Scarecrow's foresight and the cat's flair and the outlaw's boldness, they devised the final piece of the plan. The distraction, they decided, would be the work of Puss in Boots, for no one in all the world was better at causing a grand and delightful confusion than the clever cat. Puss would attend the contest too in a disguise of his own, mingling among the crowd, and at the very moment of Robin's winning shot, he would set in motion a commotion so sudden and so bewildering that all eyes would turn to it, and in the confusion, Robin Hood would slip away unseen. Just what the commotion would be, Puss would not say, for he wished it to be a surprise, and he only smiled his cat's smile and promised that it would be a distraction the town would talk of for years. And the Scarecrow, who had learned to trust the cat's flair as the cat had learned to trust the Scarecrow's foresight, was content to leave that part of the plan in Puss's clever paws. The outlaws, meanwhile, would place themselves quietly throughout the crowd, in ordinary clothes rather than their telltale Lincoln green, ready to aid Robin's escape and to melt away into the streets and back to the greenwood once he was safe. And the Scarecrow himself would come too, hidden beneath a great cloak and hood, so that his straw and his painted face would not be seen, for he wished to be there to watch over the whole affair with his careful eyes, in case some unforeseen thing should arise that only his quick, clear sight might catch in time. For the Scarecrow had learned that a plan, however well made, must have someone watching over it who can think on his feet when the unexpected comes, as the unexpected always does, and he had appointed himself quietly and without fuss to be that watcher. The archery contest. The day of the great archery contest was bright and clear, and the town was thronged with people, for an archery contest with a golden arrow for a prize was a grand event, and folk had come from all the country round to see it. Bright banners hung from the walls, and stalls sold pies and ale, and a great target had been set up at one end of a long green field, with tiers of benches all around for the watching crowd, and a high canopied seat for the sheriff himself, who sat there in his fine robes with a false smile upon his face and a cruel plan in his heart, watching the archers gather and searching every face among them for the one he sought. But the sheriff searched in vain, for Robin Hood was there, and the sheriff could not find him. Robin had come disguised as a ragged, travel-worn tinker with a patch over one eye and a limp and a shabby cloak, and he shuffled among the other archers, looking so poor and so unremarkable that the sheriff's eye passed over him a dozen times without a second glance. And Robin did exactly as the Scarecrow had counselled. When the contest began, and the archers stepped up one by one to loose their arrows at the distant target, Robin shot like an ordinary man, a decent shot, a fair shot, good enough to stay in the contest, but not good enough to draw any eye. He let the famous archers and the local champions take the lead and the cheers, and he hung back among the middling shooters, patient and unremarkable, hiding his greatness completely, though it must have cost his proud archer's heart a great deal to shoot below his skill before all that crowd. Round by round the contest went on, and the poorer archers were eliminated one by one, until only a handful of the very best remained, and still the ragged tinker was among them, having crept quietly along, without ever once shooting well enough to be noticed. The sheriff, watching from his high seat, grew puzzled and uneasy, for he had been sure that Robin Hood would reveal himself by his shooting, and yet the contest was nearly done, and no archer had shot with that unmistakable brilliance that would betray the outlaw. The sheriff began to fear that Robin had seen through the trap and stayed away after all, and his false smile grew thin and sour, and he did not know that the man he sought stood not 30 paces from him, dressed as a ragged tinker, waiting for the perfect moment. And at last that moment came. The contest narrowed to its final round, and the finest archers of all loosed their last arrows, and one great champion, a tall, proud archer from the north, shot an arrow so true that it struck very near the centre of the distant target, and the crowd roared, for it seemed a shot that surely could not be bettered, and it seemed the golden arrow was as good as won. the sheriff began to rise, disappointed, sure now that Robin Hood was not among them. And it was then, in that final instant, that the ragged tinker stepped up to take his last shot, the last shot of the whole contest, with everyone certain he could not hope to beat the great champion's arrow. The Scarecrow, watching from beneath his hood in the crowd, held his breath, which is only a manner of speaking, and Puss in Boots, hidden somewhere among the throng, made himself ready, and every outlaw in the crowd grew still and watchful. And Robin Hood, the ragged tinker, raised his bow, and for the first time in the whole long contest he let his true self show. He drew the bowstring back with the smooth and effortless strength that only the greatest archer alive possessed, and he sighted along the arrow with an eye that had never once missed its mark, and he loosed, and the arrow flew straight and true down the whole length of the green field, and it struck the great champion's arrow, the one already lodged near the very centre of the target, and split it clean in two, and buried itself in the exact heart of the mark. It was a shot that no man in all the world could have made but one, and the crowd went utterly silent for a single astonished heartbeat, and then roared louder than ever, for they had just seen the finest shot that had ever been made, and every soul among them knew, in that instant, that the ragged tinker could be no one else in all of England but Robin Hood himself. And so the trap should have closed. The sheriff, leaping to his feet with a shout of triumph and fury, understood at last that the ragged tinker was his enemy, and he flung out his arm and bellowed to his men to seize the winner, to take Robin Hood before he could flee. For a single terrible moment the whole plan hung in the balance, and the sheriff's guards began to surge forward through the crowd toward the place where Robin stood, and it seemed that the outlaw would be taken after all. But this was the moment that Puss in Boots had been waiting for, and the clever cat had prepared a distraction, the like of which that town had never seen. Just as the sheriff's men began to move, there arose from the far side of the field a commotion so sudden, so loud, and so utterly bewildering that every head in the whole vast crowd turned toward it at once. Just what Puss had contrived I can hardly do justice to, for the cat had outdone himself. There were, all at once, a great many things happening that ought not to have been happening. A cart of squealing pigs had somehow come loose and gone careering through the market stalls. A great flock of doves had been released altogether into the air with a thunder of wings. A barrel of apples had burst and sent 1,000 red apples rolling and bouncing among the feet of the crowd. Bells were ringing that no one had rung, and somewhere in the midst of it all, a voice that sounded remarkably like a cat's was crying out that the sheriff's own treasury was being robbed that very moment on the other side of the town. The confusion was total and glorious. The crowd surged this way and that, chasing pigs and apples and doves. The sheriff's men were swept up and scattered in the chaos, and every eye in the whole town was turned away from the archery field toward the marvelous commotion Puss had conjured. And in those crucial moments, while all the world was looking the other way, Robin Hood simply melted away into the crowd, shedding his tinker's disguise, and was gone. The Scarecrow, watching, saw him go safely and slipped away himself, and one by one the outlaws in the crowd drifted quietly out of the town and back toward the greenwood, until by the time the great confusion had at last died down, and the sheriff had restored some order, there was no Robin Hood to be found anywhere, and no outlaws either, and nothing left of the whole affair but a golden arrow that no one had claimed, and a town that would indeed, exactly as Puss had promised, talk of the day for years to come. The sheriff was left standing upon his high seat in a fury beyond all words, for he had had his enemy in the very palm of his hand, and had let him slip clean away, and worse, he had been made a fool of before the whole town, his cunning trap turned into a farce of pigs and apples and doves. He never did learn how it had been done, nor who had contrived the marvellous confusion, and he certainly never suspected that the mastermind of the whole affair had been a scarecrow of straw who believed himself brainless, aided by a cat in fine boots. And that perhaps was the sweetest part of the victory, that the proud and clever sheriff was outwitted utterly, and never even knew by whom. The golden arrow There was great merriment in the greenwood that night, for the outlaws had pulled off one of the boldest and cleverest deeds in all their history, and had made a fool of their old enemy, the sheriff, into the bargain, and they gathered beneath the great oak and feasted and laughed and told the tale of the day over and over, each telling grander than the last. Puss in Boots was the hero of the hour, for his marvellous confusion of pigs and apples and doves was already becoming a legend, and he strutted and preened and accepted the praise of the whole company as no more than his due, for Puss was never one to be modest about his triumphs. And Robin Hood laughed until the tears came at the memory of the sheriff standing baffled upon his high seat amid the chaos, and declared that it had been the finest day's sport he had enjoyed in years. But when the laughter had died down a little, Robin Hood rose and called for quiet, and said that there was one among them who deserved the true credit for the day, more than himself, and more even than the clever cat, and that was the Scarecrow. For it was the Scarecrow, said Robin, who had seen the hidden jaw of the sheriff's trap when all the rest of them had been blind to it, and it was the Scarecrow whose careful foresight had shaped the whole plan and kept them all from disaster. Robin Hood had very nearly walked straight into the sheriff's trap out of sheer high spirits, and would have been taken, and it was the quiet wisdom of the Scarecrow that had saved him. And so, said Robin, the true prize of the day, the golden arrow itself, which one of the outlaws had quietly recovered in the confusion, ought by right to belong to the Scarecrow. And Robin Hood took the golden arrow, that beautiful and precious thing, and he presented it to the Scarecrow before the whole company, and the outlaws cheered and cheered. And the Scarecrow, holding the golden arrow in his straw-stuffed hands, was so overcome that he could not speak at all, and a very great deal of straw came loose from him in his emotion. For the golden arrow was the prize for the finest archer in all the land, and the Scarecrow could not shoot a bow at all, and yet here it was given to him in honour of a different kind of skill entirely, the skill of a wise and careful mind, and a good and gentle heart. It was the first prize the Scarecrow had ever won in all his life, the first honour he had ever been given, and it meant more to him than any golden arrow ever meant to any archer, for it was proof, solid and shining and undeniable, that he was valued and honoured and loved. The Scarecrow kept that golden arrow for the rest of his days, and treasured it above all things, not for its gold, but for what it meant. And whenever, in the years that followed, some small doubt crept back into his gentle heart, some faint old whisper that perhaps he was a fool, and worthless after all, he would take out the golden arrow and look at it, and remember the day it had been given to him, and remember that the whole company of Sherwood had honoured him for his wisdom before them all, and the doubt would fade away again, and the Scarecrow would be at peace. For sometimes we need something we can hold in our hands, some solid proof, to remind us of a truth about ourselves that we find hard to believe. And the golden arrow was exactly that for the Scarecrow, a shining and unanswerable proof that he was wise and valued and loved. The turning of the season, the autumn deepened over Sherwood, and the leaves turned to gold and russet, and fell in great drifts among the trees, and the air grew cold and sharp, and the three friends and the outlaws drew closer about their fires in the long evenings. And it was a happy time, one of the happiest any of them had known, for they had done great good in the world, and humbled the wicked, and helped the poor, and they had one another's company, and there is no greater happiness in all the world than good work done and good friends to share it with. The Scarecrow, who had come to Sherwood a lost and lonely creature believing himself worthless, was now a valued and beloved member of the company, honoured for his wisdom, treasured for his gentleness, and content in his heart at last. And Puss in Boots, the restless wanderer, found that he had no wish to wander, so warm and so merry was the fellowship he had found. They had other small adventures as the season turned, for the poor and the troubled continued to seek out the greenwood now that word had spread of the outlaws and their strange and clever friends, and Robin Hood never turned away anyone in genuine need. There was a widow whose only cow had been seized by a grasping bailiff, and the three friends contrived, between the Scarecrow's wisdom and the cat's cunning and the outlaw's boldness, to get it gently back for her. There was a young couple forbidden to marry by a cruel and greedy father, and the three friends found a clever and kindly way to soften the old man's heart and see the lovers wed. There was a village threatened with an unjust tax, and a travelling merchant cheated of his goods, and a dozen other small wrongs set right, and in every one of them the quiet Scarecrow played his part, seeing clearly what others missed, and the clever cat played his, spinning schemes and disguises, and the bold outlaws played theirs, and together the three friends became known and loved throughout the whole district as the truest helpers the poor and the troubled had ever known. And through all these adventures, the friendship between the three grew ever deeper and warmer, until it was a bond as strong as any in the world. The Scarecrow and Puss in Boots, so different in every way, the one quiet and humble, the other bold and boastful, came to love each other like brothers, each valuing in the other exactly the qualities he himself lacked. And Robin Hood loved them both, and they him, and the whole company of the greenwood was the merrier and the wiser for having them. It was the kind of friendship that comes rarely in a life, the kind that is built not upon sameness but upon difference, each friend bringing his own gift to the fellowship, and each the stronger and the happier for the others. And of all the treasures the three friends had won in their adventures, it was this friendship, in the end, that any of them would have named the most precious. The Scarecrow makes his choice. As the first frosts came and the last leaves fell, and winter began to draw its cold breath across the land, the Scarecrow at last made a decision that he had been turning over in his careful mind for many weeks. He had thought long and slowly, as he thought about everything, about the question of home, about the flat green country of his beginning, and the greenwood where his heart had found its place. And he had come, at last, to know his own mind. He would stay. He would make Sherwood his home and the outlaws his family, for it was here, and not in the empty cornfield of his beginning, that he truly belonged. He told his friends of his decision one cold, bright evening beneath the great oak, and they were overjoyed, for they had feared that the Scarecrow might feel bound to return to his old field, and they could not bear the thought of losing him. Robin Hood clasped his straw hand warmly, and Little John, that giant of a man, declared in his great booming voice that the greenwood would not be the same without him, and Friar Tuck said a cheerful blessing over the whole happy company, and Puss in Boots, who was not often at a loss for words, found that he was too glad to say anything clever at all, and simply purred, which was a thing he almost never did, and which told the Scarecrow more than any words could have how welcome he truly was. And the Scarecrow, looking around the circle of firelit faces, all of them turned toward him with such warmth and such affection, understood that he had come by the strangest and most roundabout of roads, exactly where he was always meant to be. The great wind that had torn him from his pole, which had seemed at the time like a calamity, had in truth been the greatest blessing of his life, for it had carried him away from a place where he was lonely and idle and sad, and set him down in a place where he was loved and useful and happy. And the Scarecrow thought in his slow and gentle way that perhaps this was true of many of the hard and frightening things that befall us in life, that we cannot see in the moment of the storm, where the wind is carrying us, and that sometimes it is carrying us past all our fear and all our understanding toward the very place where we will at last be home. He did not forget his old field or the crows who had been his friends there, and he thought of them sometimes with a gentle fondness, but he did not wish to go back, for he had found something better, and there is a wisdom in knowing when a good thing has been found and in holding fast to it. And so the Scarecrow settled into his new life in the greenwood, content and beloved, and the flat green country of his beginning became only a fond and distant memory, the memory of the place where his story had started before the wind had carried him home. The widow's cottage. Of all the small adventures the three friends shared in those golden months, there is one I have not yet told you in full, and it is worth the telling, for it shows better than any other the particular way the three of them worked together, and the particular gift that each of them brought. It began on a morning of thin autumn rain, when an old widow came walking slowly into the edge of the greenwood, leaning on a stick, having come a very long way on foot to find Robin Hood, for she had nowhere else in all the world to turn. Her name was Mother Hazel, and she was very old and very poor, and she lived alone in a small stone cottage at the edge of a village some miles off, in a cottage that had been her home for 50 years, since the day she had come to it as a young bride. Her husband was long dead, and her children grown and gone to distant places, and she had nothing left in all the world but her little cottage and her small garden and her one old goat, and she asked for nothing more, for she was content with her small, quiet life. But now even that little was to be taken from her, and she had come to the greenwood in her distress to see whether the famous outlaw could help a poor old woman in her last need. For there was a man in her village, a hard and grasping man named Oswin, who had grown wealthy by lending money and seizing the goods of those who could not repay him, and Oswin had cast his greedy eye upon Mother Hazel's little cottage. It stood, you see, upon a fine spot, and Oswin wished to pull it down and build upon the land, and he had contrived, through some cruel trick of a loan that Mother Hazel's late husband had once taken and long ago repaid, to claim that the old woman owed him a debt, and that her cottage was forfeit to him. It was a lie, and a cruel one, but Oswin had a paper that seemed to prove it, an old paper with the husband's mark upon it, and Mother Hazel had no paper to prove the debt repaid, for it had been so many years ago, and who keeps such things for 50 years? And so it seemed that the law, crooked as ever, would side with the wealthy liar against the poor old widow, and that Mother Hazel would be turned out of the only home she had ever known, to end her days with no roof over her head at all. Robin Hood's face grew dark as he heard this tale, for there were few things in all the world that angered him more than the strong preying upon the weak, and few victims more helpless than a poor old widow alone. And his first thought, as ever, was of a bold stroke, of riding to the village and confronting the wicked Oswin and frightening him into giving up his claim. But the Scarecrow, sitting quietly by as he always did, gently raised a difficulty as he always did, and it was a difficulty worth raising. If Robin frightened Oswin into dropping his claim, said the Scarecrow, then Oswin would drop it only so long as he was frightened, and the moment the outlaws were gone he might take it up again, or find some other cruel way to trouble the old woman, for a wicked man who is merely frightened is a wicked man still. No, said the Scarecrow, thinking slowly and carefully, the true trouble here was the paper, the false paper that seemed to prove a debt that did not exist, and the only sure way to save Mother Hazel was to prove before the whole village that the debt was false and the paper a lie, so that Oswin's claim would crumble away to nothing and could never be raised again. The Scarecrow thinks it through, and so the three friends set their minds to the puzzle of the false paper, and it was, of all their adventures, perhaps the one that most truly belonged to the Scarecrow, for it was a puzzle to be solved by slow, careful thought, rather than by boldness or by cunning, and slow, careful thought was the Scarecrow's own particular gift. He asked Mother Hazel a great many gentle questions, more questions than the others would ever have thought to ask, about the old loan, and when it had been taken, and when and how it had been repaid, and who might have been present, and what the old woman could remember of it all. And he listened to her answers with his whole careful attention, and turned them over in his mind, and slowly, as he always did when he had thought long enough, he began to see the shape of the truth. The loan had been repaid, Mother Hazel was quite sure of it, for her husband had been an honest man who paid his debts, and she remembered the day of it, remembered her husband coming home lighter of heart, because the debt was cleared. But it had been repaid to Oswin's father, who had held the loan in those days and who was long dead now, and there had been no paper given to mark the repayment, for such things were often done on a handshake in those simpler times, and so Oswin had found among his dead father's old papers the record of the loan being made but no record of it being repaid, and had seized upon it to build his cruel and lying claim. And the Scarecrow, understanding all this, saw that the whole injustice rested upon a single point, that there was a paper showing the debt made, but no paper showing it repaid, and that Oswin was counting upon the absence of proof to carry his lie. And once the Scarecrow had seen this clearly, he saw too where the answer must lie. If the debt had truly been repaid, and it had, then there must be someone, somewhere, who knew of it, some witness who had seen or heard of the repayment in those long-ago days. People remember such things, the Scarecrow reasoned, especially in a small village where everyone knows everyone's business, and a debt cleared is a thing that would have been spoken of. And so the answer was to find that witness, some old soul of the village who remembered the truth of it, and to bring their word before the village so that Oswin's lie might be exposed and Mother Hazel's honesty proved. It was not a bold plan, nor a clever one exactly. It was only patient and careful and true, which was the Scarecrow's way, and which was exactly what this trouble needed. Now here, the clever cat and the bold outlaw played their parts, for the Scarecrow could see what must be done, but could not do all of it himself. It was Puss in Boots who went into the village in one of his clever disguises, and moved among the old folk of the place, gently and cunningly drawing out their memories, asking a careful question here and a careful question there, until at last he found what they sought. There was a very old man in the village, older even than Mother Hazel, who had been a friend of her late husband in their young days, and who remembered, when Puss gently jogged his memory, the very day the debt had been repaid, for he had been there, in the room, when the money changed hands, and had shared a cup with the two men afterward to mark the clearing of it. Here was the witness. Here was the truth, alive still in an old man's memory, waiting only to be spoken. The truth before the village, and so a day was appointed, and the whole village was gathered in the square, for word had gone about that the matter of Mother Hazel's cottage was to be settled, and everyone wished to see it. Oswin came, grasping and confident, with his false paper in his hand, sure that the law and the lack of proof would carry his cruel claim, and he stood before the village and made his case, and demanded the old widow's cottage as his right. And it seemed for a moment that he would have his way, for the old woman had no paper to answer his paper, and the crooked law cared more for papers than for truth. But then Robin Hood stepped forward, for the outlaws had come to the village that day, boldly, in the open, for a matter of justice, before the whole community, was exactly the kind of thing that even the sheriff would not dare to interrupt with so many honest witnesses about. And Robin Hood brought forward the very old man, the friend of Mother Hazel's late husband, and the old man stood up before the whole village and told what he remembered, plainly and clearly, how he had been present on the day the debt was repaid, how he had seen the money change hands, how he had shared a cup with the two men to mark it. And the village listened and believed him, for he was known to them all as an honest man, and his memory was clear and true, and it had the ring of truth that no false paper could ever have. And Oswin's cruel claim crumbled away to nothing, there before the whole village, for the word of an honest witness who was there is worth more than any paper, and everyone could see the truth of it now, that the debt had been repaid long ago, and that Oswin's claim was a wicked lie. The wealthy man's face went red and then white as he understood that he was undone, exposed as a liar and a cheat before the whole community, and he snatched up his false paper and slunk away amid the scorn of his neighbours, and he never troubled Mother Hazel again, nor dared to try such a cruel trick on anyone else in that village, for his reputation was ruined, and everyone now knew him for what he was. And Mother Hazel kept her little cottage, and her small garden, and her one old goat, and lived out the rest of her quiet days there in peace, in the only home she had ever known. And when she tried to thank the three friends, weeping with gratitude and relief, it was the Scarecrow she thanked most of all, for she understood, in the way that simple, wise old souls often understand such things, that it was the Scarecrow's patient, careful kindness, his gift for asking the right gentle questions and for seeing the simple truth at the heart of the tangle that had truly saved her. And she took the Scarecrow's straw hand in her old wrinkled ones and thanked him from her heart, and the Scarecrow was so moved that a good deal of straw came loose from him, as it always did, and he knew, once more, past all his old doubts, that he was a creature of real worth in the world. The three friends walked back toward the greenwood together that evening, through the falling autumn dusk, well content with the good they had done, and they talked as they walked of the day and of the poor old widows saved. And Puss in Boots said a thing then, half in jest, that turned out to be truer than he knew. He said that between the three of them they made one complete creature, for the Scarecrow was the mind of it, and Robin Hood was the arm of it, and he, Puss, was the tongue of it, and that no one of them could have saved Mother Hazel alone, but that all three together could scarcely fail at anything they set their hearts to. And the Scarecrow, walking along on his wobbly straw legs, thought about this in his slow, careful way, and found that it was true, and that it was one of the loveliest truths he had ever come upon. For he had spent his whole life believing that he was nothing, a single, useless creature of straw, and here he had learned that he was part of something far greater than himself, a fellowship, a friendship, in which his own particular gift, joined to the gifts of others, became something that could do real good in the world. He was not complete alone, it was true. But no one is complete alone, the Scarecrow thought. That is the whole reason for friends. We are each of us a part of something, a mind or an arm or a tongue, and it is only together, joined to those who have what we lack, that any of us becomes whole. And there is no shame in that, the Scarecrow understood, but rather the deepest kind of joy, for it means that we need one another. And being needed and needing is the very heart of love. He thought, too, as they walked home through the gathering dark, of how strange and wonderful it was that his own particular gift, the gift he had spent his whole life despising, the slow, careful patient thinking that he had taken for foolishness, should turn out to be exactly the thing the world had needed from him. He had wished, sometimes, standing on his pole in the old days, that he could be quick and bold and clever like the creatures he watched go by, and had felt himself a poor, slow, useless thing for being none of those, and now he understood that his slowness was not a fault, but a gift, that the world had quick, bold, clever creatures enough, and that what it often lacked, and sorely needed, was exactly what he had, a mind patient enough to think a thing all the way through, and humble enough to see it truly. We are each of us given some gift, the Scarecrow thought, and so often it is the very gift we are most inclined to despise in ourselves, and the whole task of a life is perhaps just this, to learn at last to see our own gift for what it is, and to give it gladly to the world. These were deep thoughts for a walk home through the woods, but the Scarecrow was a deep thinker, whatever he believed about himself, and his friends had long since learned to leave him to his slow ponderings, knowing that something wise usually came of them in the end. And when at last he shared these thoughts, haltingly, by the fire that night, Robin Hood and Puss in Boots and all the listening outlaws grew quiet and thoughtful, for the Scarecrow had put words to something true, something they had all felt but never quite known how to say. And Friar Tuck declared that the Scarecrow had spoken more wisdom in that one quiet speech than he himself had heard in a year of sermons, and the whole company agreed, and the Scarecrow shed a very great deal of straw indeed, and was happy. Winter in the greenwood. Winter came in earnest then, and it lay a great white quiet over Sherwood, and the greenwood that had been so green became a wonderland of snow and silence. The bare black branches were traced all over with white, and the ground lay deep in soft snow, and the streams grew still and cold, and the whole forest seemed to hush itself and settle down to sleep beneath its white blanket. And the outlaws drew close about their fires in their sheltered camp beneath the great oak, and made the long dark evenings warm and bright with food and firelight and fellowship. For a winter in good company is a cosy and a happy thing, however cold the world outside. The Scarecrow found that he loved the winter, though he had feared he might not, for he had never known one off his pole before. He loved the deep, soft quiet of the snowy forest, and the way the firelight glowed all the warmer for the cold beyond it, and the long, slow evenings when there was nothing to do but sit close together and talk and listen and be at peace. He was in no danger from the cold, being made of straw and cloth, and Friar Tuck had kindly patched and mended him against the winter, tucking fresh dry straw into all his warm places, so that the Scarecrow was warmer and sounder and better cared for than he had ever been in all his life. And he would sit by the great fire in the long evenings, snug and content, listening to his friends, and think that he had never imagined that any creature could be so happy. There is a small thing I should tell you about that winter, for it is a gentle detail, and this is a gentle hour. When the deepest cold came and the snow lay heaviest upon the forest, the outlaws built, close by the great fire beneath the oak, a snug little shelter of woven branches and warm hides, and they made it for the Scarecrow, so that he might sit within it out of the wind and the wet, safe and dry and warm. It was the first thing that had ever been built in all the world for the Scarecrow alone, the first place that was truly his. And when the outlaws showed it to him, shy and pleased with their work, the Scarecrow was so moved that he could not speak for a long while, for he had stood his whole life upon a bare pole in an open field, exposed to every wind and every rain, belonging to no one and cared for by no one. And now here were friends who had built him a warm and cozy place of his very own, simply because they loved him and wished him to be comfortable. And the Scarecrow sat within his little shelter that first snowy night, warm and dry and dear to someone at last. And he thought that if the great wind had blown him across the whole world only to bring him to this small, warm place among these dear friends, then it had been the kindest wind that ever blew. And it was on those long winter evenings that the Scarecrow and Puss in Boots had their best and deepest talks, for the two friends had grown to love nothing so well as to sit together by the fire when the others had gone to rest, and to talk of all the great questions of life in their different ways, the humble Scarecrow and the clever cat. They spoke of wisdom and of cleverness and of the difference between them, for they had come to understand that they were not the same thing at all. Cleverness, Puss said, was quick and bright and dazzling, and could win a castle or spring a trap or conjure a confusion of pigs and apples. But wisdom was slow and deep and quiet, and could see the truth at the heart of things, and know what was truly worth doing, and cleverness without wisdom was a dangerous thing, a sharp tool in a careless hand. And the two of them agreed that the best of all was the two together, the cat's cleverness and the Scarecrow's wisdom, each guiding and tempering the other, and that this was the very reason their friendship worked so well and their schemes so seldom went wrong. They spoke, too, of the strange roads by which they had each come to the greenwood, the cat from his mill and his castle, and his years of wandering, the Scarecrow from his lonely pole and his great wind. And they marvelled at how unlikely it all was, that a talking cat in boots and a walking Scarecrow of straw should ever have met at all, let alone in the depths of Sherwood Forest, let alone should have become the dearest of friends. And they agreed that the world was a stranger and a more wonderful place than anyone gave it credit for, full of chances and coincidences and unlikely meetings, and that the wisest thing a creature could do was to keep an open and a hopeful heart, and to be ready to find friendship and belonging in the most unexpected of places, for you never knew, they agreed, where the wind might carry you, or what wonderful thing might be waiting for you at the end of the storm. What became of them all? And now our tale draws toward its close, and I will tell you, as a storyteller should, what became of them all, for it is a comfort at the end of a story to know that those we have come to love went on to happy things. The miller and his family lived on in their mill by the stream, safe and content, for all the rest of their days, and they never forgot the strange friends who had saved them, and there was always a warm welcome and a good meal at the mill for any of the Greenwood company who cared to visit, and they visited often. The children grew up hearing the tale of how a scarecrow, a cat, and an outlaw had saved their home from the greedy lord, and they told it to their own children in time, so that the tale lived on in that family for generations, growing a little grander with each telling, as the best tales do. Sir Aldous Grim kept his oath, from fear, if not from goodness, and troubled the poor no more, and grew, if not exactly kind, at least no longer cruel, which was a very great improvement, and the people of his lands lived in far greater ease and safety than they had before. And whether his heart was ever truly softened, or whether he merely feared the greenwood too much to return to his wicked ways, I cannot say, but the result was the same for the poor folk who depended on him, and that is what matters in the end. And he never did learn that the silver stag had been a thing of cloth and cleverness, and perhaps, in some corner of his cold heart, the memory of that shining creature glimpsed in the dusk did him some quiet good all his life. The sheriff remained the outlaw's enemy to the end, of course, for such was his nature, and he never forgave the humiliation of the archery contest, and he laid many another plot against Robin Hood in the years that followed. But he never again came so close to catching him, and every one of his schemes was foiled, more often than not by the quiet foresight of a certain Scarecrow who could see the hidden jaw of any trap. And in time the sheriff grew old and weary, and gave up his plotting, and Robin Hood outlasted him, as the good so often outlast the wicked in the end, by the simple strength of being loved. And the three friends, the Scarecrow, the Outlaw, and the clever cat, lived on together in the greenwood for many happy years. Robin Hood continued his good work, defending the poor and humbling the wicked, and the tales of his deeds spread ever wider through the land, and he became the most beloved outlaw in all the history of England, as indeed he remains to this very day. And it is said that whenever he told the tale of his life in his later years, he never failed to speak of the strange autumn when a scarecrow and a cat had come to the greenwood, and he always said that of all the friends he had known in his long and adventurous life, none had taught him more, nor been dearer to his heart, than the gentle straw scarecrow who had believed himself a fool and had turned out to be the wisest soul in all of Sherwood. Puss in Boots stayed with the company in the greenwood, his restless wandering heart contented at last, and lent his cleverness to 100 good causes, and was as merry and as boastful and as dear to them all at the end as he had been at the beginning. He never did lose his taste for a fine boot or a jaunty hat or a good bold boast, and the outlaws would not have had him any other way, for his cheerful vanity was as much a part of him as his cleverness, and both were dearly loved. And the Scarecrow, the gentle wise Scarecrow who had once believed himself the most brainless and worthless creature in all the world, lived out his long life honoured and valued and beloved, the trusted mind and the quiet heart of the whole greenwood company, at peace with himself and his place in the world at last. Before we come to the very end and to the quiet part of the night where sleep is waiting, let me gather up for you the heart of this long tale, the thing beneath all the adventures, for a story like this one is really about something underneath all its outlaws and its schemes, and it would be a shame to walk all this way through Sherwood together and miss it. This was a story, in the end, about three creatures who each thought they knew what they were, and who each turned out to be something more. The Scarecrow thought he was a fool, and turned out to be the wisest of them all. The clever cat thought that cleverness was the finest thing a creature could have, and learned that wisdom was finer, and kindness finer still. And the bold outlaw, so used to solving every trouble with courage and a strong arm, learned that there were troubles that only patience and cleverness and quiet foresight could solve, and that the greatest strength of all is knowing when not to fight. Each of them grew, and each of them learned, and each of them became, through their friendship and their adventures, a fuller and a finer version of what they already were. And most of all, it was the Scarecrow's story, the story of a gentle soul who believed himself worthless and learned, slowly and against all his own doubts, that he was worth a very great deal. And if there is one thing I would have you carry with you from this long night's tale as you drift off toward your sleep, it is this. The Scarecrow was wise not in spite of believing himself a fool, but in a way because of it, for his humility kept his eyes clear, and his heart open, and his mind slow and careful, and these are the very roots of wisdom. And so if you should ever, in some dark hour, believe yourself foolish or useless or of little worth, I would gently ask you to remember that the ones who fear such things about themselves are so often, like the Scarecrow, the very ones who are wise and kind and precious beyond their own knowing. The doubt itself is so often the proof of the worth, and you are worth a very great deal indeed, more than you may know, more perhaps than you can quite believe, just as the Scarecrow was. The great wind carried the Scarecrow away from everything he knew, and it must have seemed, as he tumbled through the sky, like the end of his small, quiet world. And yet that terrible wind was carrying him, all the while, toward friends he had not yet met, and a home he did not yet know, and a happiness he had never dreamed of. And so it sometimes is with the winds that carry us, in our own lives, away from all we know, and into the frightening unknown. We cannot see in the storm where we are being carried, but sometimes, past all our fear, we are being carried home. And that is a gentle and a hopeful thing to hold in your heart as you drift toward sleep, that even the hard winds may be carrying you, in the end, toward some good place you cannot yet see. Good night from the greenwood. And so we come to the end of our long walk through Sherwood together, you and I, and it is time now for you to rest. Let the last of the story settle over you softly, like snow falling on the quiet winter forest. Picture the great oak of the greenwood, its bare branches traced with white, and beneath it the warm glow of the outlaw's fire in the deep blue dusk. Picture them all gathered there, safe and content, the bold outlaw and his merry men, the clever cat in his fine boots curled contentedly by the flames, and the gentle, wise Scarecrow sitting among his friends with his golden arrow beside him, honored and beloved and at peace. Everyone is warm. Everyone is home. Everyone is exactly where they belong. You do not have to carry any of it now, not the schemes or the adventures or the long walk through the wood. It is all done, all solved, everyone safe, everyone home. Let your shoulders come down and your hands fall open, and let yourself grow as warm and as easy and as content as a Scarecrow, snug by a winter fire among the friends who love him, with nowhere to go and nothing to fear, and all the long quiet night before you. Let the greenwood grow still and silent in your mind, the snow falling soft, the fire burning low, and let it carry you gently down into sleep. The story is told, the forest is quiet, the fire is low, and everyone is safe and warm, and so are you. Sleep now and sleep well, and may your own hard winds, whatever they are, be carrying you gently toward home. And if you are still here with me now at the very end of this long tale, still listening in the quiet dark, then let me say one last soft thing to you before you go. Thank you. Truly thank you for spending this long, slow evening with me and with the friends of the greenwood. It means more than you know to have you here. If these tales bring you comfort and help you find your rest, I would be so glad if you would come and visit the rest of them, for there are many more stories waiting on my page for the nights ahead, and I would love for you to make yourself at home among them. But that is for another evening. For now there is only sleep, and you have earned it, and it is waiting. Rest well, dear listener. Good night, and sweet dreams, and until the next tale, sleep gently and be well.